Policies regarding this war were determined in the world diplomacy arena, and the Allies began to advance their strategies accordingly. Looking at the situation, we see that Ukraine's allies are much more deterrent and stronger than Russia's allies. However, despite all of this, Russia's recent bold moves with the support it received from China had increased the tension. Violations of international airspace these days were much more prominent among the factors that increased the tension. NATO member forces all over the Baltics and other European countries was the last straw. For a long time, Russian jets and supply planes have been intercepted as they attempt to enter Alliance airspace. Recently, Russian initiatives in the Baltic regions have been increasing even more. The last response of the United Kingdom and German air forces against such moves of Russia on this subject was recorded as the most striking example in the history of world wars. This striking news had an earthquake effect on the world agenda. Let's take a closer look at these stunning moments. UK and German fighter jets intercepted a Russian spy plane and 2 warplanes over the Baltic Sea, preventing another tense encounter between Russia and the West. The German Air Force had reported that Eurofighter aircraft were deployed by both countries to detect Russian aircraft, including 2 Sukhoi Su-27 fighter jets and an Ilyushin Il-20 aircraft. 2 Su-27 flankers and an Il-20 from Russia were flying again without transponder signals in international airspace over the Baltic Sea. One of the planes was a Russian Air Force Il-20 Kut, an intelligence aircraft escorted by Su-27 Flanker B warplanes and headed for Kaliningrad on Russia's border with Poland. However, the German Luftwaffe emphasized that the Russian reconnaissance flights were completely prevented by stopping these planes. Germany's efforts to finally intercept Russian planes marked the 6th time that Russian and NATO planes had collided in less than 2 months. Such encounters are common in the region, as Russian military jets frequently fly between the Russian mainland and Kaliningrad. As a NATO member, Germany constantly monitors its airspace over the Baltic states for such dangerous situations. But recently, Germany had transferred responsibility for NATO's Baltic air policing mission to the United Kingdom. This was because Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia did not have their own warplanes and therefore cooperated to protect the airspace of their NATO allies. Following the reshuffle in the Baltics, security measures in the Baltic states have been strengthened since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. This deterrent role of NATO hampered Russia's reconnaissance and espionage plans. But despite NATO's prevention efforts, Russian military jets have routinely breached airspace over the Baltic Sea in recent months. If you recall, one of Moscow's warplanes nearly shot down an RAF surveillance plane over the Black Sea in 2022, according to leaked Pentagon documents. And that would almost potentially drag the United Kingdom into the Ukraine conflict. This threat by Russia initiated the entry of a Su-27 jet fleet from Moscow into international airspace near the Russian-occupied Crimean Peninsula. The close contact of the Russian Su-27 jet squadron with an RAF RC-135 Rivet joint observation aircraft escalated tensions. This stunning news was confirmed by British Defense Secretary Ben Wallace, who stated that Russian jets were approaching within 15 feet of the RAF aircraft and that someone had even launched a missile nearby. Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu acknowledged the missile launch after UK Defense Minister Ben Wallace spoke with other Russian defense officials. Shoigu also claimed that the Russian jet had a technical malfunction to cover this issue. However, according to previously released U.S. military records, Russian missile fire narrowly missed the Royal Air Force aircraft in a critical incident described as the near shooting of the British RJ. Some sources even claim that one of the Russian planes launched a missile near the Royal Air Force plane and this missile damaged the plane. However, the British defense source reported that the allegations about this issue were false. The UK source explained that this does not reflect what is happening in international airspace above the Black Sea. If a Russian missile had hit the rivet joint in the Black Sea, the United Kingdom and its NATO allies might have been forced to go to war. But fortunately, Russia did not make such an unreasonable move. The flights carried out by the Russian Air Force so far have generally not gone beyond disturbing NATO and especially the USA. Now NATO is much stronger. In other words, Finland's participation in this international military alliance could result in a reduction in such harassment flights by Russia, because as a deterrent in this critical geography, it is necessary to consider not only Finland, but also the possibility of Sweden's participation in NATO. In addition, the presence of Norway, which borders these two countries, is a different deterrent. You know that Norway will allocate 2 more NASAMS air defense systems to the Ukrainian armed forces. In addition, Norway is one of the countries that increased its military expenditures almost twice as much as Sweden and Finland, taking into account the Russian occupation of Ukraine. For this reason, it is obvious that these 3 Scandinavian combinations, which constitute a serious power element in the Air Force, will have an impact on Russia's dangerous flight actions. It is an inconceivable situation that the world history has not witnessed for a long time, as the US, as well as Europe, made a common voice against the occupation of Ukraine, and the Scandinavian countries united and opposed Russia. But over time it is expected that the whole world will cooperate much more against Russia and the Russian supporting countries. It seems that Russia is making such threats by using its air force, and navy power will gradually decrease. You know that in addition to the Air Force, Russia was also conducting military exercises in naval areas, especially nowadays in harmony with China. However, with China's withdrawal of support against Russia, the Moscow administration's plans to pose a threat in critical areas such as the Indo-Pacific will decrease. If all these scenarios come true, Russia may finally have a nuclear trump card. The head of the United Nations Disarmament Affairs warned that the risk of using nuclear weapons is higher than it has ever been since the Cold War. Belarusian military forces have started training to use nuclear-capable Iskander ballistic missiles, according to the Russian Ministry of Defense's announcement via its official Telegram channel. Belarusian crews have been training in the southern military district of Russia since the beginning of April, and the Belarusian crew received instruction on the use of Iskander-M short-range ballistic missiles capable of launching low-yield nuclear weapons. Also, during this last training, special attention was paid to the further development of the practical skills of the Belarusian crews in preparing the missile system for use, training on deployment, as well as conducting combat training launches. However, it is a low probability for Russia not to find what it hopes for from air and naval power and to embrace nuclear weapons. The reason for this is the strategy followed by the United States and the United Kingdom, 2 of Ukraine's strongest allies. If Russia takes all the risks and plunges the world into a nuclear crisis, the consequences will be severe. The USA and UK are among the countries that will react first in this regard. As we mentioned, Russia cannot afford this situation. Yes, the Ukraine war has worn out the Russians, but neither leader Vladimir Putin nor any high-ranking official in the Kremlin has lost that much logic yet. In short, such rhetoric by Russia is aimed at deterring NATO from helping Ukraine and hindering the growth of the international alliance. But so far, Russia has not been successful in these policies. The Donbass region completely turned into a fighting ring this week. Ukraine's eastern front lines have started to move a lot. Mobility in the war began to shift towards Luhansk, especially from the Donetsk region. Now let's dive into the striking moments of the war from Donetsk, Luhansk without wasting time. Our first stop is the city of Bakhmut, the most important front line of the Donetsk front line. The city witnessed the fiercest and most critical battles. The small but important city of Bakhmut was subjected to heavy attacks by the Russian forces. Ukrainian forces are trying to repel all attacks of Russian forces in order to keep the city standing. Let's all turn our attention to the general situation of the front lines in the eastern region where many important clashes took place. The Russian forces continue to carry out offensive operations in the Kupiansk, Lyman, Bakhmut, and Avdiivka directions, which are their main efforts. Russian forces did not succeed in an attempt to attack nearby Lohorivka in the Luhansk region. The Russians fired dozens of artillery shells at civilian settlements near the front line in the Kharkiv region. In addition, Russian forces did not succeed in their attacks on civilian settlements on the outskirts of Avdiivka in recent days. Russian forces have had a remarkable failure. This failure helps Ukrainian forces get what they want. The Ministry of Defense of Ukraine provides information about the front line with the statements it frequently shares on the subject. Now, let's take a closer look at the painful situation of the Russian forces by examining the recent critical situations and violent clashes in Bakhmut. Working hard day and night with our expert staff, we strive to deliver hot information and special analysis from the front to you as quickly as possible. You can support us with the Super Thanks button below. The Ukrainian Air Force carried out numerous attacks in the city of Bakhmut, which was seen as the center of the war. As always, the target of the Ukrainian forces were Russian military assets. Recently, the Ukrainian Air Force carried out 15 attacks on Russian troops in just one day. While the Russian troops are aiming to besiege the city of Bakhmut, the attacks of the Ukrainian troops nullify this effort. In addition, a Russian arsenal was blown up in these attacks. When we cross from Donetsk, Luhansk, Ukrainian forces destroyed a Russian ammunition depot in Kadayevka, 24 miles behind the front line in the occupied territory. Immediately after their critical attack, the city of Kadayevka is a Russian-occupied settlement in the Luhansk region of eastern Ukraine, where Putin's forces are believed to be storing military stocks for use at the front. For this reason, the Ukrainians cut off the supply routes of the Russians between Luhansk. The Russians, who are already having problems with ammunition, will now have difficulties in making military supplies in Luhansk, especially to the Kremlin and Stachova front lines with the destruction of this arsenal. On the other hand, the head of the Luhansk Oblast Military Administration, Sir Heyday, published images of the explosion and confirmed the attack. The shells fired by the Ukrainian forces directly hit the Russian long-haul trucks. Russian forces made great efforts to put out the fires. Huge smoke rose from the place where the explosions took place. Despite the massive smoke, Russian media dubbed the eruptions Pavlovna, a term they used to downplay. Voivodina means cotton in English. The phrase is now used by Ukrainians to make fun of the explosions in Ukraine that Russia claims is the territory they have annexed. But the scale of the attack was much larger, contrary to what was portrayed in the Russian media. It is not known how much longer Moscow could hide that Russian arsenals are melting away on the territory of Ukraine, but the situation seems very serious for the Russian army at the moment. On the other hand, the city of Kadayevka is located in the Luhansk region of eastern Ukraine, one of the 4 regions illegally annexed by Putin last September. To remind you, Russian forces use the facilities in the occupied regions as military bases and arsenals. If the Ukrainian forces detect that the facilities are being used by Russian forces, they carry out attacks without wasting time. According to the first information received, this arsenal where the Ukrainian forces attacked was previously used as a factory. Russian forces were trying to hide ammunition trucks at this factory from UAVs of Ukrainian forces. Serhiy Heyday stated that Pavlovna is in the factory where the Russian forces are trying to hide their ammunition trucks. Kadayevka is located about 24 miles from Bakhmut and about 35 miles from Kremlin. Due to its proximity to 2 from front lines, Kadayevka is a logistical hub for Russian forces, assuming a long period of fierce fighting on both fronts. Ukrainian forces seriously damaged the offensive capabilities of Russian troops in the direction of Bakhmut and Kremlin. President of Ukraine Volodymyr Zelensky made a speech to the citizens of Ukraine containing information about the situation at the front. Although Zelensky described the current situation of the war as very difficult, he stated that Russian forces have not yet surrounded the city. Hiro Chernihiv, a Ukrainian deputy and head of the Ukrainian delegation to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, explained that although Bakhmut is not of strategic importance for Kiev, they will still try to keep it as long as possible. Chernihiv noted that the Russians were gradually crushing their most combat-ready units, and regardless of the future fate of Bakhmut, they managed to gain valuable time. At the same time, he noted from Chernov's words that the Ukrainian forces are gathering strength for future counterattacks. Chernihiv stated that in recent months the Russians had to spend enormous resources and reserves to take Bakhmut, and he pointed out that the Ukrainian forces were planning this. So why is Russia risking such great losses to seize Bakhmut? If Moscow aims to seize Donetsk and Luhansk by the spring, then taking Bakhmut could be an important milestone in the eastern move. Michael Kaufman, director of Russian studies at the US-based Center for Naval Analysis, noted that the route to Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, both of which have been hit by recent Russian missile attacks, passes through Bakhmut. Ukrainian and Russian forces have been fighting in the Bakhmut region since May. Neither side can gain new territory, but they wear each other out badly. Ever since the Russian and Ukrainian troops began to concentrate their troops and resources on the small city, Bakhmut became of paramount importance as a battlefield. So far, Russian forces have not been able to advance beyond the city's outskirts and disrupt crucial ground lines in the city that were used to supply Ukrainian forces. This helped the Ukrainian forces strengthen their defense. The failures of the Russian forces have increased so much that they no longer think they can take Bakhmut. As a result, Russian soldiers in eastern Ukraine have no morale or motivation to attack. As usual, the Kremlin government chooses to lie to boost the morale of the frontline soldiers. The Russian government announces imaginary attacks and victories through the media, especially in the Bakhmut region. The Kremlin government's lies are exposed by the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. A lot of vital changes happened in the Bakhmut region here after the Ukrainians conducted a counterattack. The head of the Wagner forces said in an interview that the situation is very challenging and that they won't be able to take Bakhmut for at least several more months. But interestingly, a much bigger role here played an essential betrayal of the Russian generals. Last time I told you that the Russians devoted a significant amount of resources to expanding control to the north of Bakhmut. I also clarified that the Russians have not encircled Brestkovska and that the Ukrainians still control the situation and have enough room for a controlled withdrawal, which they would likely conduct the moment the Russians break through the primary line of trenches along the highway. And this is exactly what happened today. Today, at night, the Russians managed to push the Ukrainians out of the approximate 3 belts, which shifted their defense towards the forest area. This forest area was basically the last cover that the Ukrainians could use to withdraw from Palisivka. The Ukrainians took advantage of the tactical pause and left Palisivka several hours ago. Various Russian sources started publishing photos that confirmed that Brestkovska had changed hands. This once again shows that the Ukrainians exert a lot of control over the situation, which allows them to continuously escape Russian cauldrons. Nonetheless, the situation here has undoubtedly deteriorated. The next Ukrainian line of defense goes through Dubova, Vasilivka, and Bafuka. If you look at the topographic map, we will also see that the Ukrainians control the hills right above these 2 villages. This means that the Ukrainians can leverage the tree belts and forest areas to prevent the Russians from assaulting the villages. And this is exactly what they are doing. The Ukrainians are holding the trenches on the hills, which allowed them to rebuff all Russian attacks towards Dubova-Vasilyevka. However, the Russian successes in Paraskovia have been offset by their losses in the southern part of the region. As you remember, the Ukrainians here conducted a counterattack and pushed the Russians around 1.5 kilometers back. Today, Russian sources finally confirmed this information as well and expressed concern that this was only the first wave. And it looks like it is true, because yesterday the Ukrainians conducted a rotation of all troops in this region and are also moving in several additional fresh battalions. The intensification of air reconnaissance, which is mainly conducted by drones, also signals that the Ukrainians are analyzing Russian defenses in the forest. And the fact that the Ukrainians started using their aviation more frequently signals that it will be highly likely engaged during the counterattack. But this is not the only reason why the battle for Bakhmut is far from being finished. What is interesting, yesterday, the head of the Wagner forces, Prigozhin, said that they are facing huge challenges and that the Ukrainians will continue holding Bakhmut not only till the anniversary of the war in February, but also likely through the whole March and maybe even April. He essentially said that the Russian Ministry of Defense tried to make Wagner fail because they benefit the recruitment of prisoners and they do not provide them with enough resources. A day before this interview, footage appeared showing how Wagner forces were asking the Russian Ministry of Defense to urgently give them ammunition. The first reason why the Russian Ministry of Defense is purposefully degrading the most capable Russian units is the following. In the absence of their own achievements and in the light of a series of catastrophic operations near Volodar, Wagner simply make them look bad. Wagner forces use a decentralized command, while regular Russian units use centralized command. Russian generals do not want to implement decentralization because it takes away their power. That is why all alternative structures are deemed expendable and are kept small. The second reason is that the shortage of resources is actually real. Right now, Russia is trying to kill two birds with one stone, conduct large-scale military operations without disrupting the internal ecosystem. Russian factories physically cannot increase their output of military equipment and ammunition without total mobilization of the economy because they need to find, hire, and train a lot of people. Russian difficulties with the revitalization of their military-industrial complex are very fortunate for the Ukrainians because its Western partners also have big problems with jump-starting their military-industrial complex, although here the reasons are a bit different. Right now, both Europe and the US are struggling to hold off recessions, and this recessions in the meantime have already pushed people's savings to the brink. And any cash that we hold is being eaten dinner by inflation, which is still rampant worldwide. Even putting money into stocks has been a losing game for the last year. But real assets can still gain and hold value in times like these. And real assets include not only gold and real estate, but also contemporary art. Historically, contemporary art had some stellar appreciation, outpacing not only inflation, but also the S&P 500 for the last 26 years.